Can't play it anymore, but I enjoyed it when I played it.
Move over.
All right, good morning, everybody. Y'all look good in your flannel, nice and comfy and warm today. My flannel's a little tight. I don't know if I'm getting bigger or if they're making shirts smaller. I'm going to go with the second. Yeah, they're just making shirts smaller, I think. Well, I hope you're doing well. Hope your week's going well, and everybody in your family's doing well. We're going to continue in our Genesis study this morning. If I can find a place to put this mic real quick. Go ahead and open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 11. Really, we're going to begin at the end of chapter 10, verse 32. I want to catch that last verse there and then jump over into chapter 11 as we talk about the Tower of Babel today. There's a lot of text at the end of the story of Noah where they get off the boat and then this big chaotic event plays out. We're going to skip over that just for the sake of trying to get through all the major stories within Genesis. We can't go through every detail. That would take a lifetime. But actually, my father-in-law did a study over Genesis, and I think it took him 4 years. And everybody made fun of him for that. And they picked on it. They didn't make fun of him, but they picked on him about it. And I thought, man, I don't want to spend 4 years going through a book. Y'all may run me away after that, but. So we're just going to hit some of these highlights, some of these big stories, and today we're looking at the Tower of Babel. So chapter 10, starting in verse 32, and I put it up here on the screen. This thing should work today. I don't know why it's not. I put brand new batteries in it. Give me 1 second. All right, well. Paul, you'll get to sit in class one of these days. Hey, Paul, if you want to stay, it's not that important. I put text up there. There's nothing really that's like. Well, it's this that's the problem. It's not really. It's got to be this. I don't know what else it would be, but I put brand new batteries in it. So. Oh, it's green. It's working. It's somewhere in the cloud that's not working. That's all I know about technology, is that there's a cloud somewhere that controls everything. Anyway, so somebody read for us verse 32, and then in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And pay attention, because I'm going to ask you some questions here.
Said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
All right, let's do our typical thing here. What's weird about this? Everything, right? Right. So point some things out to me. What are some issues you see in this story? What are some problems that you encounter just from face value? Jay?
Does a builder tar for mortar?
Okay. Yeah?
One thing that bothers me about this story is the fact that it happens immediately after the flood, because we don't really know how many years that is, but how can you have so many people
Okay.
that need scattering so soon after the flood?
Right? Like, so if you're reading it in a chronological timeline, thinking about time as the way we think about time, it's a big problem, right? What else? Anything weird jump out to you, Sharon?
Well, it sounds like, okay, it's odd to me that he said that if the language in there would be nothing that they couldn't do. Well, look at what all we do now. Does that mean he doesn't want us to advance?
That's one I wrote. We'll talk about that one. Anything else? Russ?
As we read the New Testament, God wants us to be unified as one
Right?
and working together. Here he's doing
Right. So the scattering issue is a big deal here. Like it's almost counter, productive to what it seems like God wants us to do. That kind of plays into what Sharon's saying here. Yeah, right.
Could they really build a tower to the heavens?
Right? Like,
Was this before space was there? So that now, obviously, we've gone pretty high these days.
yeah, is Elon Musk there and is he like directing this whole thing? Yeah, it's kind of bizarre language. It's like, wow, talk about a goal. That's a lofty goal, right? Chad?
I remember reading this that being like talking about the brick, and it didn't make me realize till now that it replaced something that was not working correct as good as the brick. Like
Yes.
a new invention that was better.
We'll talk about that as well. Yeah. Yes, we will. Yeah, so there's a lot of language here that's bizarre, and just like most of the stories that we've read up to this point in Genesis, it's different. It's unique. And when you read it, you got to ask the question, like, what is going on here with this and that and this and that? Right out of the gate here, you see people trying to become more Eastern. You hear that language again, and God says, no, we're not cool with that. Like, we're not going to do that. We talked a little bit about that up to this point, but this language, it almost seems as if God is West and God is found in the West. And we know that's not factually true, but the language that's being used, we don't typically, from our Western mindset, don't get confused here as I use West and East language to talk about the West and East language in the text, but we just read over geography and we don't pay attention to it, but it's playing into this story. Remember Adam and Eve, they leave the garden and they move which direction, the text says? East. Cain and his family and his lineage, they move east. And then Noah and the flood happens. God brings people back west. And then there's a story of recreation. He brings them back, and then they leave the ark and they head east. And then Noah in the vineyard and the family is heading east. And now, all the nations of the world are heading east. And one of the things you keep seeing is people are continually moving further and further and further away from God's will. And the authors are giving you a geographical metaphor to play into that. Again, it's about image. It's about picture. They're painting a picture for you to learn a lesson. The picture here is that people keep moving away from God's original intent. And all of a sudden, you start to realize that evil is really organizing itself. Evil's starting to get its act together. And just when God had seemingly done away with all of evil, it's like, boom, here it is again. And so it starts with a family. It starts with a man and woman. It organizes itself to a nation. And then in the story of Noah, you get all the thoughts of man were evil. It has organized itself. And so other problems you get with this story, which were brought up, in the end, God scatters them over the earth. That's what he did. But even before God shows up in this area or in this story, if you notice in the text, even before God scatters them, they're worried about being scattered. Is that not odd? Like, do they have some insight as to God is going to scatter them? Like, even before that happens, they're worried about being scattered. And so it's kind of weird to me. Why is that a worry? Why do they even consider that a possibility? How does everyone speak one language? Because I don't know, you have all these different other stories of people who've gone off, they've done their own thing at various times. There's these different cultures that are already forming in different locations. How do they all have the same language? Interesting. Lonnie?
One thing that bothers me, it says in that first verse, and the whole earth was of one language
Right,
and of one speech.
right.
And then it says that it came to pass as they, the whole earth,
Yeah,
couldn't have been all that many.
right. So,
They journeyed east, and they, the whole earth, found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there.
right.
Now that was the whole earth.
Yes.
That was all the people.
Lonnie, good for you. Like, way to read the text, Because you start to see, maybe this isn't trying to teach me what I thought it was trying to teach me. Because if you can't make sense of stuff that you read in these stories, maybe there's something else you're supposed to learn from these stories. Have you seen that so far in our study of Genesis? If you haven't, then I've failed you as a teacher. And if you haven't, then you haven't been paying attention. Because that's what's happening again. Now, in order to talk about the story of Babel, we need to start here. One of the things we need to talk about is that the Hebrew language doesn't have vowels. Maybe you already knew that. I hope you knew that. Hebrew just has consonants. And the vowels are done by what's called breathing marks that they put around the Hebrew letters, and they're placed over the consonants that tell you what guttural sounds to make when you pronounce this letter or this sound. And so the Hebrew language, especially the ancient Hebrew biblical language, is a mass of consonants. And you can hear that if you listen to Hebrew audibly. You definitely don't catch any of that if you read it in English. Also, side note here, and this is for you people that really love to study the Bible, and I think that's most of you, so I'm going to tell all of you. If you would like to learn Hebrew, at least learn the alphabet, there are great resources for that. One book that I've used is a book you can pick up on Amazon. It's called How to Read Hebrew in 6 Weeks. Literally, you devote 6 weeks to learning Hebrew, and you can pretty much learn the basics of Hebrew. It's a great little book. And then BibleHub.com is a great resource. And Blue Letter Bible, you've probably heard of that one. That's a great resource to help you walk through, and you can audibly listen to the Hebrew of the text. And whether you understand it or not, it's still extremely beneficial it's amazing to me just to sit and listen to Hebrew. And it's like, everybody's spitting and hocking loogies and all, it's just this crazy, beautiful, bizarre language. But one of the things that's happening here in the story of Babel, the Tower of Babel, is that the consonants are very repetitive. And I tried to go through the Hebrew and highlight this for you. It was taking me way too long. I was like, no, I'm just going to tell them and they can kind of figure it out on their own. But if we were to talk about transliterated consonants, the consonants that are at play here in this text are nun, bet, lamed, and hey. And I'm pronouncing those in a very English way, okay? Nun, bet, lamed, and hey. And these are the consonants that appear. So when you look at the Hebrew text of the story of the Tower of Babel, they appear in a repetitive order. And then what happens is they flip and they mirror and they appear in a repetitive order. So if you have Hebrew letters that are recurring in a certain pattern and then they flip and they mirror, what are you looking for? A chiasm. And where are you wanting to go? Right to the middle. That's right. You are learning something. I love it. So just story after story after story, you see they have been chiastic. And all these stories, there's pretty much a chiasm in every single one of them. And remember, we even pointed out, I think when you notice the language about scattering, there's language at the beginning about scattering, and then there's language at the end about scattering, and then there's language in the middle about scattering. And so you see repetition even in the translation of the text. And so when you see these consonants, you got to be kidding me. Kidding me, Smalls. So it's killing me, Smalls, but I'll use all kinds of phrases. Yeah. So anyways, Paul, you don't have to sacrifice. Okay, all right, just make sure. I just feel bad. Thanks, Alex. So when you take these consonants, the N, the B, the L, the H, you look at how they're being played out in this story here in the Hebrew, and you realize that there's a front half and a back half. And the center of the story ends up being the phrase in chapter 11, verse 4. Somebody read that verse for us again. Chapter 11, verse 4. And the very middle is this last half of it. 11, verse 4b. So somebody read this for us.
Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the earth, O Lord."
All right, so I started in chapter 10, verse 32, because that's kind of where this chiasm starts. And then as you go through verse 9, you get the bookends of the chiasm. And then right here in the middle, the treasure that is to be found, the whole meaning of this story is about being scattered. And here's the verse where they're worried about being scattered. Now, by the way, we've been talking about these stories and how they parallel other stories. Thus far, have you picked up on that? Typically, you'll have a story and it parallels another story. Remember how the story of Noah paralleled the creation narrative? We kind of walked through that imagery and those metaphors. Cain and Abel. Now, Cain's curse was that he was going to be what? Yeah, banished, kind of scattered, be a wanderer. And at the center of this chiasm, the point of this story is about the people being scattered and God not wanting them to settle. That's what this is about. And when you look at 11 verse 4, you're going to see that the point of the Tower of the Babel chiasm is that God does not want his people to settle. He wants them to keep wandering. He wants them to keep moving. And I think I hear allusions there to the same principle. Like we discussed a few weeks back about the Garden of Eden and the cherubim guarding the tree of life. God put that in place, and God didn't want them to what? Settle. He didn't want them to just eat from the tree of life and settle down and perpetually live in an eternal state of hell, because that's what they would have been doing. And so God does not want his people to settle and be in a fixed state away from his will, or we could say east. He wants to return. He wants them to return to his will, to trust him and to trust that his way is best, and then finally settle. They're not there yet. It's not time for them to settle. God does not want his people to settle until they come back home, west. So it raises this question of why would the entire point of the story, why would this chiasm point us to God's desire to scatter humans over the whole earth? Is God really threatened by their advances? What do you think? Sharon kind of brought up this point, and Russ brought it up, why keep them scattered? Is God really threatened by their advances? There's this weird dialogue. Go to the next slide, Alex. Thank you. Throughout the story and here in this story, if we don't do something, God in the divine council, in the Trinity, in the Godhead, is if we don't do something, we're going to be in trouble here. One of the problems I have in this story when I read this story is God saying if we don't do something, they're going to be able to accomplish anything? Doug?
Well, could it be that he wanted them to be scattered so they would depend on him versus being together and depending on each other
Okay.
and not, you know, I don't know, it's like he wants them to be scattered so they will depend on him versus having a city and they're all safe and sound and they don't need God.
Right. So the temptation for Adam and Eve that we get in the story is basically what? They wanted to become big G gods. Like they wanted to know good and evil. They wanted to know all that God knows. Seemingly is part of the temptation. And here, it's a similar temptation, isn't it? We want to reach heaven, if that's even doable, if they can even accomplish that. But for me, it's like, it's odd that you get this language. It's if we don't do something, they're going to be able to accomplish anything they want. And my question is, isn't that what God wants? Like, isn't that what God wanted for his original creation? Does this remind you of a statement made in a previous story? Yeah, if you remember in Genesis chapter 3, when God says, now that the man has become like us, we got to kick him out. We got to knowing good and evil, he must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat it and live forever. It's this similar, you see these stories paralleling each other and you see similar ideas going on here. But isn't being able to accomplish anything a good thing? Wasn't that the point of the beginning of the story? And now God's like, well, we can't let them just accomplish anything they want to. Nancy?
Well, I don't think they were trying to, they weren't working within God's will building this tower.
Right.
Because, it says, let's make a name for ourselves.
Yes.
Not let's glorify God.
Right.
So that's, I think, why it all had to be stopped. Because they had such impure motives.
All right. So this is about them, not about God. What else? Why do you think God is threatened by their advances? Why do you think he's trying to... Yeah, James.
I don't know if it's true or not, but I've seen that the word for tower was actually an obelisk, and they were putting
Okay.
things in high places.
Sort of like an idol.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
Putting it over God.
Right. Okay, so there's that play in language for sure. Paul?
I won't say what most obelisks were, but
Right.
they were phallic and
Yeah.
symbolically.
I won't say it, but I'll say it. Yeah, go ahead.
Obelisk is, if you look at it. Anyway, God gave Adam and Eve a command.
Mm-hmm.
Be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah. Scatter.
Well, he wants to fill the oceans with the fish,
Okay.
so he wants to fill the earth with people.
Right.
So he gave them a command to do that, and when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they get prideful, and they do exactly what they want to do
Okay.
instead of what God wants them to do.
Okay, so scattering was the original plan.
Yeah.
Scattering God's will was the original plan. Gina?
How do they know, though, or do you think they knew what the whole earth was? At that point, did they know the earth was round? They weren't going to go so far and fall off? Or, man, if you're walking 20 miles is a long ways, they might think, gosh, if we walked this far, this is...
They're tired. Yeah. 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 Is the earth round? I'm just kidding. No. I just talked to your son, and we had that same, right. What is their knowledge at this point? Does that even play into this story? How do you, wrap your mind around a lot of those questions. Any other thoughts before we keep rolling here? All right, so you start seeing parallels. I hope you're picking up on the parallels in the different stories. These post-flood stories are paralleling the earlier pre-flood stories, and in the future we'll try and spend more time tying all these stories together, but that's something you need to pay attention to when you study the Bible. So God started this story by affirming the goodness of creation. It's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. All the way back in the Garden of Eden, he invited humanity to join him in trusting him and trusting the story, to join him in his rest, to join him in being fruitful and multiplying. And Adam and Eve, they failed to trust God. It became about them. They failed to master their desires and they pursued themselves. And then you see this story paralleling that as well. Cain is invited to trust in God's goodness and avoid the consequences that, our insecurities and our fear bring us, but he fails that test as well. And then God reaffirms the goodness of creation in the story of the flood. You see that parallel, the story of creation. He recreates creation in this story in a sense, and you could say, like everything's going good, you think, but then Noah steps right out of the ark and pursues revenge, trying to step into the role of God. And once again, mankind is headed east. And so God knows that man is not ready to exercise their creativity in its fullness, is what I see here. Like God has given us that creativity. God has given us that ability to flourish and spread and bring his will, but man is simply not ready to do so. They haven't learned how to harness their desires. They don't know when to say enough. They don't know when to stop creating, and they don't know when to stop destroying. And what we've seen time and time again up to this point in these stories is that God does know when to stop. God does know when to pause and rest, and God does know when to quit destroying. Mankind hasn't figured that out yet. So there's a lot you can see paralleling this. There's a lot you can see pointing to the center of the chiasm here. This is why this story is about scattering, because scattering is God's will here, and he can't let them settle, so he scatters them. I've heard this story taught in a lot of different ways, but one of the most intriguing ways is what Chad brought up. And I first heard that talked about by Rob Bell. And Rob Bell talks about how they've created the brick, which is this amazing creation. It's this new technology. This whole story is about advancements of technology and the wonderful things that we can do with technology. So they create a brick and they decide that they're going to build a tower, because you think up to this point they've only built with rocks, and rocks do what? They roll off. So a rectangle rock is an amazing invention at this point in human history. You can do a lot with rocks that stack on top of each other. And so they create a brick and they're deciding to build a tower. Now, one of the things you notice in the story is God doesn't have a problem with that. God does not have an issue with them building a tower. That's not the issue at all. They say, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. The brick, this new technology, is not a problem because God doesn't say anything. If it was a problem, the author would have insinuated this is an issue. But if you look at the beginning of verse 4, it says, and they said, or your version may say, then they said. And in the Hebrew, anytime you see that inserted, it means the conversation is shifting, or it may indicate this is a separate conversation. It's as if there's an interruption here in the dialogue. So you can feel the tension build as you read, and then they said, dun, dun, dun. It's like everything's going good. They got this new technology, and then dun, dun, dun. And then they said, let us build a tower to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Like plot shift, the drama, the action of the movie's about to start, and the tension starts to build, and the question hangs in the air as the reader. We've been let down by mankind again and again and again, and so the question hangs in the air: will mankind go down the same path again? And if you parallel these stories with others, you can predict the end of this story. And the answer is yes. Because the thing that we have to ask ourselves, and one thing that we can apply to our lives from this story, is how are we going to use technology, like in our lives? The internet is a wonderful gift, but how are you going to use the internet? We can use it for incredibly bad things, or we can use it for incredibly good things. Cell phones, what a wonderful creation. We don't live without them. Like they function pretty much in every aspect of our lives these days. And they are a great thing, but how are you going to use them? You can use them for good, or you can use them for incredibly destructive Eastern type things. And I don't mean that geographically. I mean it like the story means it. And so are we going to use this for God's redemptive ends, or are we going to use it for our own selfish means so that we may make a name for ourselves? Are we going to know how to harness our desires, and are we going to know when to say enough? That's enough. They say, let's make bricks. God says nothing because that's fine. And then in verse 4, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. By the way, what was Cain's story rooted in? It was rooted in his name, but does anybody remember what his name meant? Acquired. I have acquired. That's what his name means. And so that's how the story is built around. So again, we have a story here about acquiring and what? Names. Let's acquire a name for ourselves. It's just yet one more parallel here. But it's at this point that now you see God enters the story. It says he came down to see the city. Can God not see the city from where he's at? It's not 3D. It's, he had to come down to see the city. Like, when I read this, I'm like, why does God have to come down? And if God is through all, above all, in all, like, why is he coming down anyways? Isn't he already here? Like, isn't God here most of these stories up to this point? Like, God is in their midst, and like, did he leave? Is he residing somewhere and he has to come down? So it's language here that God is portraying himself with these human characteristics, with these human qualities in order to emphasize a point. We are not to assume that he literally had to leave heaven and come down and act. This is language to emphasize a point. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the author says that God came down to see how bad everything was. Like, it's the same kind of language. He already knew, obviously. So when they decided that they're going to take this technology, this brick, and use it to acquire, God's like, all right, time for me to go in. It's like when you know something bad's going on in your kid's room, it's like, all right, time for me to enter the room. Like, time for dad to come down hard. You know, it's this moment of, I'm going to go down and I got to change things. Like, things aren't going well. It's as if God says, that's it. If you're going to keep going down this road, and then he has this conversation. If they're going to go down this road, they're going to be able to do anything. I have to intervene. We have to intervene. So we got to mix things up here. Which leads me to my next observation, which I find really interesting. Most scholars agree that the word used for Babel is a play-off of the Hebrew word for confusion. And so God steps into the story, and it's interesting to note what God does not do. All right, this is important. God does not punish them. God does not wipe them off the face of the earth again. He's made a promise not to do that. God does not condemn the work project in and of itself. Again, the brick is not bad. God doesn't do that. He doesn't curse anybody. The story is free of curses. He doesn't deal out punishments, consequences for sin, anything like that. What he does do is he confuses all of humanity with a disruption of their language. Interesting, isn't it? That he chooses to disrupt their language, the way they communicate. Why do you think that is? Christy?
Because if you confuse somebody's language, you have to learn about them in a different way. And you have to build a relationship with them and work together with them. And you go further.
Gold star for you, Christy. That's exactly right. If I can't communicate with you, I can't work with you. If we don't know what each other are thinking, or we can't communicate on how we're going to build this tower, we can't build a tower. Because you're going to be over here making bricks, and I'm over here like, we're not ready for more bricks, and everything's going to fall apart. So it's interesting to note, like, in order for humanity to continue to progress as a whole and to continue to flourish and to continue to bring about good, we need to learn each other's languages, don't we? We need to learn how to communicate with each other. You cannot learn the language of another culture or people without learning something about their perspective. You just can't, because languages flourish and they affect within the culture within which they operate. And so learning the diversity of perspectives always provides one with a sense of pause and a sense of consideration. And so it requires a sense of learning how to control what? Your own desires, your own will, in order to reach a common goal together and in order to reach unity to achieve that goal. And so in the confusion of Babel, God has not so much slapped our hands as he's given us another gracious project. Like, it's another extension of grace.